A few years back, there was this friend of mine. Let's call her Amanda. We'd been close for years, that type of friendship where you just click with someone. No pretense, no awkwardness, just a solid connection. I guess you could say I had a soft spot for her, though nothing ever came of it. She was one of those people who knew how to navigate my quirks without getting annoyed, and in turn, I appreciated her balance of wit and warmth. It wasn't one of those stories where we were best friends who secretly loved each other but never said it out loud. No, this was different. We were good friends, and that's how things stood. Until that day. It started like any other. I was heading into work, coffee in hand, trudging through my routine. I'd been on the grind for weeks with barely a moment to breathe, let alone think about anything outside of work. So when my phone rang during my lunch break, I wasn't expecting much. It was Amanda. We hadn't talked in a few weeks, but that was typical for us. We had one of those low-maintenance friendships, the kind where time passes, but nothing changes. I figured it was just going to be a catch-up, hey, how have you been, kind of thing. Except that's not how it went. Instead of small talk, the first thing I hear is, "I'm so horny. Want to drive up and we'll fudge like bunnies?" Now I'm a pretty composed guy, but that threw me for a loop. I nearly choked on my sandwich. I mean, this wasn't the sort of thing I expected from Amanda. Not out of the blue like that. We'd joked around before, sure, but never anything like this. After a brief moment of shock, I recovered enough to ask, "Wait, are you serious?" Her laugh came through the phone, light and teasing, but she wasn't backing down. "Dead serious. I've been thinking about you, and I thought, why not?" Well, what do you say to something like that? I'm no saint, and of course, I wanted to. She wasn't just some random hookup. This was Amanda. That added weight to the whole situation. Part of me was thinking, is this going to mess up everything? But another part of me, the louder part, was just like, hell yeah. There was only one problem. She lived 5 hours away, and I had a shift early the next morning. I told her as much, thinking that would be the end of it, that the practical side of things would kick in and we'd laugh it off as a joke. But Amanda, being Amanda, just shrugged it off. "You don't have to come tonight, drive up tomorrow. No rush." And just like that, it was settled. I mean, how could I say no? That night, I barely slept. I went through the motions of work the next morning, but my mind wasn't there. All I could think about was the drive, the anticipation. It's funny how 5 hours can feel like an eternity when you're waiting for something you really want. Every mile felt like it stretched out longer and longer. I had music blasting, trying to keep myself distracted, but even that didn't help. I kept running through scenarios in my head, wondering how it was going to play out. It wasn't just about the physical part either. This was Amanda. If we crossed that line, would we ever be able to go back? By the time I pulled into her driveway, my nerves were shot. I parked the car, took a deep breath, and texted her that I was there. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and there she was, looking exactly the same as she always did, casual. Like this wasn't a big deal, but there was something different too, a tension in the air that hadn't been there. We didn't jump each other right away. In fact, it was awkward at first. We sat down, had a beer, and talked like we always did. She asked about work. I asked about her family. For a moment, it felt like maybe this was all just some strange prank. But then, just as I was starting to think I'd driven all that way for nothing, she set her beer down, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "So, are we going to do this or what?" That's when it hit me. This was really happening. As soon as I got out of the car, she was already outside waiting for me. And the moment we saw each other, we shared this big hug. It felt familiar. Comfortable. Exactly how you'd expect after years of friendship. But even in that embrace, something felt a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it right away, but there was this subtle tension, like a shadow hovering just outside the frame of a picture-perfect moment. "Come on in," she said, flashing me that smile I'd seen 1,000 times. We walked inside, exchanging a few more pleasantries. But the small talk was half-hearted, like we both knew there was something else hanging between us. Before I even had time to process everything, we were in her bedroom. That's when it hit. We weren't just two friends anymore. We were teetering on the edge of something more. As we sat on the bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her energy was off. Normally, Amanda was this vibrant person, confident and self-assured, but right then she seemed hesitant. There was an awkwardness that hadn't been there before, a stiffness in her movements, and I found myself second-guessing everything. I tried to brush it off. I mean, who wouldn't be a little nervous in a situation like this? But even though the vibe was weird, she wasn't pulling back entirely. So we kept going. Some kisses, hands wandering, the whole deal. But there was a weight in the air that made it all feel strange. It wasn't the excitement I'd anticipated during that long drive up, and something in the back of my mind was telling me to slow down. Then, just as things were starting to get more intense, she suddenly stopped. I barely had time to register what was happening before I heard this quiet, shaky sound. She was crying. And let me tell you guys, if a woman starts crying in a moment like that, it's like the universe throwing up a giant red flag saying something is very wrong here. My heart dropped into my stomach. This was not what I had imagined. I pulled back immediately, sitting up straight, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Hey, what's wrong? I asked, genuinely concerned now. I could see she was struggling with something, but I had no idea what. For a few long seconds, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, wiping her face, trying to calm down. Finally, after a couple of deep breaths, she looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy, and said the words that no guy in my position wants to hear. I'm sorry. I don't see you that way. You. That hit me like a ton of bricks. She went on, stumbling through her words, clearly trying to explain herself. It's not you, she said, her voice wavering. I like you, I do. You're one of my closest friends. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm lonely, and I thought maybe, I don't know, I thought it would make me feel better, but I just can't. I sat there, still trying to process everything she was saying. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Here I was, having driven 5 hours, fueled by anticipation and nerves, only to find out that it wasn't going to happen. Not like that, anyway. And it wasn't just that she wasn't into it. It was that she didn't feel that way about me at all. She liked me, sure, but not like that. It was a gut punch, but at the same time, it made sense. I could see it now. The awkwardness, the hesitation. She wasn't just nervous. She was conflicted. She'd wanted to feel something more. But in the end, she couldn't force it. I'm really sorry, she kept saying, her voice cracking with each apology. I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm so lonely, and I thought... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But I got it. I understood. She'd been reaching out, trying to fill a void, but I wasn't the right fit for what she needed. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me was hurt. Of course I was. I'd come all that way, thinking this was going to be something it wasn't. But at the same time, I couldn't be angry. She hadn't done it to lead me on. She was just trying to figure things out. Just like me. It's okay, I finally said, though I wasn't sure if I really believed it at that moment. I get it. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I wasn't sure what to do next. I mean, what do you do in a situation like that? There's no handbook for how to deal with your close friend breaking down after you've almost crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. After a few minutes, she spoke up again, her voice soft. I don't want this to change things between us, she said, her eyes searching mine. I really don't. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if that was possible. Things had already changed, whether we wanted to admit it or not. We just tried to cross the boundary between friendship and something more, and it hadn't worked. That's not the kind of thing you can just forget about. Still, I didn't want to lose her as a friend. Whatever else had happened, Amanda was important to me. And I didn't want this one awkward moment to ruin everything. So I gave her a small smile and said, "We'll be fine. Don't worry." We talked for a little while longer, but it was clear that the mood had shifted. The lightness that usually filled our conversations was gone, replaced by this heavy, unspoken thing that hung between us. After a while, she offered to set up the guest room for me, and I took her up on it, too drained to even think about driving back home that. As I lay there in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but replay the entire night over in my head. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined, that's for sure, but maybe it was for the best. Things were complicated enough as they were, and maybe some lines just aren't meant to be crossed. And here's the kicker. After all that, after she'd poured her heart out and told me she didn't see me that way, she looked at me, eyes still wet from crying, and said, "But I mean, if you still want to, we can. You drove all this way." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I just stared at her for a second, trying to process what she'd said. It wasn't that I didn't get it. She was trying to be considerate, trying to make it feel like my trip wasn't wasted. But the idea that she'd go through with something she didn't really want just because I'd put in the time and miles, that felt all wrong. I wasn't exactly jumping at the idea after everything that had just happened. The whole situation had shifted so dramatically from what I thought it was going to be. When I left home that morning, my head was full of anticipation and excitement. Now it was just awkward and sad. There was no way I could go through with it, knowing her heart wasn't in, and honestly, mine wasn't anymore either. Not after that conversation. "Amanda," I said gently, "you don't owe me anything. I'm not here to collect on some trip or whatever. If you're not into it, I can't be either. It's fine, really." She looked relieved, but also a little guilty, like she was still worried about disappointing. But I meant what I said. Yeah, I'd driven 5 hours, but what was the alternative? Go through with something that would make both of us feel worse afterward? That wasn't what I wanted. Not with her. So we hugged it out, both of us trying to push past the awkwardness that had settled in. It was a long, tight hug. One of those where you try to say more through the embrace than words could convey. There was so much unspoken stuff between us in that moment, things we couldn't or wouldn't say, but at least we both knew we were okay. No hard feelings, no bitterness. After a few minutes, we pulled back and she gave me a small smile. One of those, let's move past this kinds of smiles. "Let's just make the best of the weekend," she said, her voice softer now. "I don't want it to be weird." I nodded, though in my head, I wasn't sure how we were supposed to pull that off, but we were both committed to trying. So we did our best to brush the awkwardness aside and salvage what was left of my visit. We grabbed a couple more beers, and before long, we were sitting in her living room, watching some random movie neither of us had really paid attention to. For the rest of the night, we avoided talking about what had happened in her bedroom. It was like there was an unspoken agreement between us to just move on and act like everything was fine. And to some degree, it worked. We fell back into our usual rhythm after a while, joking around, sharing stories, and just enjoying each other's company like we always did. It felt a little forced at first, but by the time we were a few beers in, we were laughing about dumb things again. And for a moment, it almost felt like none of that had happened. Still, every once in a while, I'd catch her looking at me with this far-off expression, like she was still mulling it all over in her head. I didn't bring it up, though. I figured it was better to just let it be. That night, she offered to let me crash in the guest room again, and I took her up on it. It was late, and the idea of driving another 5 hours back home was the last thing I wanted to deal with. I was drained, emotionally and physically, so I was more than happy to just sleep it off and figure things out the next day. The next morning, things were a little more normal between us, but there was still that lingering awkwardness, the kind that doesn't go away overnight. We grabbed breakfast at this little diner near her place, and for the most part, it felt like we were just two friends hanging out again. We talked about random stuff, work, life, whatever, but there was this undercurrent, a tension that wasn't there before. Every so often, we'd hit a lull in the conversation, and I could tell both of us were thinking. At one point, she sighed and said, "I'm really glad you came, even though you know." I just smiled at her. Yeah, me too. And the thing was, I meant it. I was glad I went, even though it didn't turn out the way I'd expected. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't the weekend I thought I was signing up for, but I learned a lot about Amanda and about myself. Sometimes you think you know someone, hell, you think you know yourself, and then something happens that makes you realize you don't have it all figured out. It's messy and it's awkward, but it's real. After breakfast, we decided to spend the rest of the day just hanging out. We hit up a local park, grabbed some coffee, and walked around. It was nice, actually. There were still those moments of silence, but we didn't try to fill them with forced conversation anymore. We just let them be. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I knew it was time for me to head back. As we stood by my car, she gave me another one of those hugs. The kind that lasts just a little longer than usual, like we were both acknowledging that things had shifted between us, but that we were still going to be okay. "Drive safe," she said, her voice soft. "And hey, don't be a stranger." I chuckled and promised I wouldn't. "I'll text you when I get home." And with that, I got in my car and drove off, heading back down the long stretch of highway that had brought me there in the first place. The drive home was quieter. The excitement and anticipation from the day before had been replaced by reflection. I replayed everything that had happened in my mind, from the phone call to the awkward bedroom moment to the conversations we had after. It wasn't the trip I thought it, but maybe it was the trip I needed. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had started to dip below the horizon. I sat there for a minute, just thinking. It was funny how things could change so quickly, how one phone call could lead to an entire weekend that left you questioning so much about yourself, your relationships, your expectations. I grabbed my phone, shot Amanda a quick text to let her know I made it home, and then headed inside, feeling both relieved and strangely grateful that we had navigated such a messy situation without losing each other in the process. We did what we said we'd do. We salvaged the weekend. After I'd gotten a decent night's sleep and shook off the weight of everything that had happened, Amanda suggested we go out to dinner. It was like hitting a reset button. We walked into the restaurant with no expectations, no pressure, just two friends who were trying to make the best of a complicated situation. Funny enough, we ended up having a surprisingly great time. Maybe it was because the tension had finally broken, or maybe it was because we both realized we weren't trying to be something we weren't anymore. Either way, the conversation flowed more easily, and by the time we were halfway through our meals, we were laughing about stupid things like we always used to. The awkwardness from the night before had loosened its grip on us. We stuck to safe topics. Nothing about the almost thing that happened. Nothing about feelings or what could have been. It was just a good, simple night. By the time we left the restaurant, I was feeling better about the whole weekend. Sure, things hadn't gone the way I thought they would, but I realized that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes life throws curveballs, and you have to adjust mid-swing. We didn't head back to her place right away, though. Instead, she took me on a little tour of her town, pointing out some spots I hadn't seen before. It was one of those nights where everything just felt right again. The kind of night where you remember why you're friends with someone in the first place. We wrapped it up by grabbing some ice cream from this little mom-and-pop shop she loved, and for a moment, it felt like things were just normal again, like the weekend had reset itself. By the time we got back to her place, it was late, and we were both tired, so I crashed on her couch again. I didn't mind it at all this time. It felt like the right place to be. The tension from before had melted away, and we'd found our footing as friends again. The rest of the weekend passed by in a blur, but the most unexpected part. Amanda introduced me to one of her friends the next day. It was this casual thing, nothing forced. She just invited her friend over for a barbecue, and we all hung out. I wasn't expecting much. After all, the weekend had already been full of surprises, and the last thing I was looking for was something else to complicate things. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Her friend, let's call her Rachel, was easygoing, funny, and we clicked almost immediately. I wasn't trying to make anything happen, I was just trying to enjoy the moment. But as we all sat there, grilling and joking around, I realized I was having a really great time, and Rachel seemed to be feeling the same way. By the end of the weekend, Amanda had more than made up for the initial awkwardness. She'd somehow managed to set me up with someone who, as it turned out, I'd end up dating for the next 6 months. We hit it off, started texting and calling after I left, and before I knew it, we were in this long-distance thing. Ironically, it was another 5-hour commute, just like with Amanda, but this time it felt different. It felt like it could actually work. For 6 months I made the drive, or she'd come down to visit me. We made it work for a while, both of us putting in the effort to keep the connection alive. But as anyone who's been in a long-distance relationship knows, it's hard. Really hard. Eventually, the distance started to wear on us, and no matter how much we liked each other, 5 hours is still 5 hours. There's only so much you can do when geography is stacked against you. We broke it off, amicably, after realizing that we couldn't keep up the back and forth anymore. It was tough, but we both knew it was the right call. Sometimes, no matter how well things are going, the logistics just don't line up. Looking back on that weekend now, it's kind of funny how it all played out. What started as a trip to potentially cross a line with Amanda turned into something completely different. The initial reason for my visit didn't pan out, but in a way, it led me to something else entirely. And while that relationship didn't last, it taught me a lot about myself and what I was really looking for. The moral of the story? Well, if I've learned anything, it's that when tears start flowing, it's a surefire sign to call it quits. You can't force something that isn't there, no matter how many miles you've driven. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work. And the more you try, the more frustrated you get. But sometimes, if you're open to it, life has a funny way of giving you something better, even when it's not what you originally had in mind. In the end, Amanda and I are still friends, and every so often, we'll joke about that weekend. She even joked that she was better at setting me up than dating me, And honestly, she's not wrong. And Rachel? Well, we're not together anymore, but we're on good terms. There's no bad blood, just two people who gave it a shot and realized that for all the good between us, the distance was too much. I don't regret the trip, not for a second. It wasn't what I expected, but it ended up being something I needed. And sometimes that's better than what you were hoping for in the first place.